Okay, so whenever you have Maya make a play blast, it makes it into an AVI. And in this particular case, I just have, I saved out the one play blast that we just did as a test movie. And it was out of QuickTime, so it was a movie, and I didn't save it as an AVI out of there. When you have an AVI, you can tell QuickTime to play AVIs by default. And if you do that, whatever movie player you've set to play AVIs as a default, then Maya will use that player when you make a play blast. Okay? So how you do that? Well, you right click on the file and you go to get info. And then inside of here you'll see open with. In this particular case, my QuickTime player here is set to open AVIs. And once you select that, say I change this to like this, you can click on change all, and then what that does is say all movies that have this extension will open up with this particular player. Okay, I'm just going to move that back because this movie player for me is set to play movies, and AVIs are set to be played with QuickTime 7 for me, because there's some features in there that I like using. But you can use this QuickTime player as an output as well. Okay, and then go from there. Okay, so that's how you do that real quick in getting that type of output. Okay, so if we go back, right, you can be in steps if you want. It's fine. And what you'll see is this pose, and you'll see that pose. Now, I didn't have everything selected when I converted back to steps. Right, so step there. So I have this pose and I have that pose. And that's what you typically see. People tend to kind of push you towards that when you're setting up your first passes and that kind of thing. Okay. Now it looks like both feet are moving, but it's really not, because this foot is in place. It's just rotating down, and the other foot's actually coming all the way around. So, okay, you don't see that until it starts to interpolate. But you can be in linear. I say start out in stepped if you want, but then midway through your first pass, as you're keyframing things, you want to start to see this interpolate. You want to see what's going on midway. You want to see where the body is. You want to start getting a feeling for the timing and how that feels. If you're in linear and it looks like it's taking too long to get from this pose to that pose, that means that your keyframes are too close together, right, for that action. In this particular case, we're pretty safe, but depending on the walk, depending on what you're doing, depending on the action, if it's acting and stuff like that as well, you want to make sure that I have a good sense of timing as early as possible. So the length of time it takes to get from here to here, if the action feels like it's taking too long to get to that point, keyframes are too far apart, means you need to squash the time down. Whenever the action looks too fast, maybe it's happening too quickly, then it means, and you have to think about your other actions that, your other poses that you have in between. You think about your passing position, think about any breakdown that you may need depending on how fast the action is, right? You should kind of plan that out, appropriately. Make sure you have a middle keyframe and that kind of thing. You can always squash your time down, but it's harder to spread things out time-wise, because then you run out of time, or you end up having to make your animation really long, and it's just because you packed in a lot of action, but it might not be necessary. So always try to get your timing in place as quickly as possible early on, and then you'll have a better structure to work with later. Okay, so if you are in linear, you can just use your period and your comma key on your keyboard, and that will move you from frame to frame. Okay, so that's a way that you can kind of flip back and forth to see what it would look like from pose to pose, just like if you were in stepped, where you're working from pose to pose without having to be in stepped. So you can start there, but get into linear quickly and then move forward from there. So that's the general kind of process of setting up your one pose and then another pose. In the next video, we'll talk about what goes on midway and what happens between those points and the next contact as we're going.